I'm Lisa Tyson Ennis, and I'm an artist in Castine.
So, Lisa, tell us when you first knew you were an artist and first identified as an artist.
I've always liked making things. I've always been, loved to use my hands, loved to cook, loved to make things. So I guess I've always been making things. And when I knew I was an artist, I guess when I was spending all my time doing photography.
When was that in your life?
Well, I've been doing photography since high school. There was a dark room in my high school, and I spent a lot of time in there. And then all my free time after work and everything, I'd be in my dark room. I've always had a dark room, so pretty much I guess that's when I knew I was going down that path.
Was there ever any other option for you of work that you would do?
No.
I've read that you've said your work is not really about storytelling, and it's very poetic, however, and it seems like you yourself identify with poets. Is that something that I'm picking up on that's true? There
is always a bit of a backstory in my work, but it's not in the forefront, if that answers that.
And is that backstory something that's just between you and the work, or you hope it's between you and the viewer too? I
really want the viewer to take what they need from the work, so I'm very focused on beauty in the work, but there is a backstory to all of them. And, you know, if the viewer is interested, you know, I think it could be pretty clear what the story is.
Your work is very atmospheric, about location, about setting, about place. Could you talk a little bit about how place inspires you?
Well, place, I guess I start with the story, and the story takes me to the place, and then really it becomes about the light.
You talk about the story and the light and the place. How did you develop that unique voice, your unique voice? Because I think I could look at one of your works and say, that's one of Lisa's works. I think I could identify it with your signature.
I'd love to hear that.
How did you come up with that voice that is yours?
It started with two photographers that I very much admire, Michael Kenna and Sally Mann. Both had a very large influence on my work. Michael Kenna's work, I think I began with him just trying to teach myself, because I'm not trained, I'm not a trained photographer. And so I really pored over Michael Kenna's work, because there's always in his work a bit of, always beauty, but a bit of melancholy also. And I was always drawn to that. And certainly Sally Mann's work has some very powerful backstory with her work.
And what about Maine itself? I mean, for so many artists, you know, the line is there's something about the light in Maine, and in your case, even farther north than Maine. What is it about Maine, though, that draws you? You've lived in a couple different places in Maine, and now you're in Castine.
I was just so drawn to Maine when I was 15, I took a canoe trip down the Allagash, a 5-week canoe trip down the Allagash in St. John, and that was my first introduction to Maine, and I've just been smitten ever since. And for me, it's the water. It's the ability to walk along the water and be alone, lakes, river, you know, Maine is just phenomenal with that. So that's what.
Could you give us a picture of what one of your outings, one of your shoots looks like? What time of day might it be? What do you have with you? And what happens in that moment?
So typically I've planned where I'm going to go, and I would get up very early, usually around 3 o'clock, so that I can be, depending on the season, but so that I can be out long before the sun comes up. I do shoot at night, but it's typically really early in the morning, so it's still dark. And so my exposures are very long, typically a half an hour, and the film can collect over time the scene, and so it's not something that you can see with your eye because the waves are coming in and out and the clouds are blowing over, and so it's always a surprise what I'm going to get on the film, which is always exciting. But it's usually very quiet. I'm out there by myself, and it's very peaceful. It's.
And what are you doing while that exposure is taking place for those 30 minutes?
I'm enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm walking around and possibly looking for another shot, and just making sure that everything's going correctly, and I don't know, just enjoying it, listening to the sounds of the animals and the waves. It's a very peaceful time.
It strikes me that your work is often, not always, but often very quiet. That there's something behind that quiet that's slowing us down. Maybe in the same way the exposure slows you down. Could you talk a little bit about the role of quiet in your work?
I think you're right on. I am looking for quiet, and it's funny because I'm looking for peace, but there is an edge, and I'm not just trying to make a pretty picture, but I think the quiet, I'm hoping anyway, the quiet and stillness of the image give people sort of an entree into looking at it a little bit longer and trying to unravel that backstory a little bit.
Your work is also not typically shot in color.
Never.
Could you talk about that choice?
I just think that a handmade silver print is one of the most beautiful things out there. So I never do any digital, and I never do any color, except for the cyanotype, which makes its own color, and that's a whole different thing. But I just think the handmade silver print is just so rich, and there's so much depth to it that that's my choice.
When we first talked about your work, you talked about the Weirs in Canada, where you, Grand Manan, where you had been, and something about them really drew you. They're not nature, like a lot of your work. They're really the handprint of a human.
Yes.
What drew you to the Weirs? So many artists have been drawn to that.
Yes. Well, first of all, they're magnificent. They're enormous, and you may not be able to see in some of them just how big they are, but they're enormous, and they're all handmade, and they're a very sustainable way of fishing. So I was drawn to all of that. And technically, there's something that's still in the water while the water and the clouds are moving. So it makes for this very interesting sort of dynamic thing that looks still, but it's not at all. So I was drawn to them for that, and for their backstory of the loss of herring and the destruction of fishing industry, you know, the loss of fish right now.
That's a big issue.
It's a big issue.
It is.
Yeah.
Structure also plays a role in your work, whether it's a human-made structure or a nature-made structure. What draws you to an image that you want to shoot?
Well, I think almost all of my work has some junction of man and nature. Almost every one has some sort of human presence in there. And I think I do that, I'm drawn to that because I think it allows people to put themselves in the image without showing an actual person there. So the structure, I think, often becomes that, the substitute for the person.
It makes a lot of sense. It's also something about your work feels very old, and yet the technology of it, which is also kind of not an antique technology, but it's not the most modern photographic technology.
Right.
So there's, I don't want to say nostalgia because that doesn't feel right to me, but it's almost like an homage to the past.
And it is. Because these processes, I think, are, you know, the wet plate collodium process is from the 1850s, and I just think they're such beautiful processes, and thankfully there's really been a resurgence in people figuring out how to do these antique processes. Even film, you know, you go to colleges now and they're not even using film or showing the darkroom. So, yeah.
I've seen Ansel Adams' name kind of in several articles about you. And when I look at your work, I see, as I said before, a signature that feels very much Lisa, now that I've looked at it. The photographer I sometimes feel it relates to a little bit is Alfred Steichen. And I wondered if you had been drawn to his work.
Not really, actually. Very drawn to Steichen's work. Not so much Stieglitz.
Interesting. I think it's the contrasts that remind me so much of him. Is there a type of photographer that you've been drawn to?
How do you mean a type?
Someone who shoots a certain theme or in a certain mode.
Certainly Sally Mann, using the wet plate collodium process, and really being kind of a bad girl and breaking the rules of that, and the just what she comes up with by doing that and not making these perfect images. They're just raw, and they I really love her work. So yeah.
Is there an easy way for you to explain the wet plate collodium process?
Yeah, basically you're making your own film on glass. So you're pouring a liquid onto a piece of glass, and you put it in silver nitrate bath, and it becomes light sensitive. And then you take that dripping out to your camera and put it in your camera, and then you have to develop it right away. And it has absolutely no grain. So they're just magnificent. If you get it right, they're magnificent. And they're on glass. So, you know, if you make a contact print, an 8x10 contact print, you have just the most high definition image you could imagine.
And you mentioned earlier that you basically work in 3 formats. Could you say what those 3 formats are?
Yeah, so I work with traditional black and white film, And I work with this wet plate collodium process that I just described. And then I've been also working with another 19th century process called cyanotype, which a lot of people may know from Anna Atkins' work, who was the first female photographer, actually. And she was using the cyanotype process to document seaweed specimens in England, and made beautiful, beautiful images with cyanotype, and made first book out of them.
Could you also give us just a little window into your sense of creativity, where it lives in you? When do you think about it? Do you think about it when you're out in the field, when you're in your studio, when you wake up in the morning? When does it happen for you? Or are you even aware of it? Can you qualify it?
I know, I think it's just always there. And sometimes it's super powerful, and I can hardly wait to go get my camera. And you can ask my husband, like, we've had to make some side trips. No, I think it's just, I'm always thinking about it.
That's funny because you haven't mentioned a camera yet in this conversation, which is so interesting. And obviously it is the central unit in a way with your darkroom of the work that you do. What kind of camera or cameras do you shoot with? So
I have a very beautiful Kodak Masterview 8x10 camera, and I use this gorgeous old 19th century brass portrait lens on it, which was never intended to be used for landscape that way, but I love it. And so I have that. I have a Wisner 4x5 that I use with film. I have a Hasselblad that I use quite a bit for film. And then the cyanotype process is a cameraless process. So it's just directly onto the sensitized fabric or paper or whatever you're using.
And could you just say something about your darkroom, because it's a unique room? We'll look at it later. But could you just say something about what was important to you when you were developing that darkroom, what you absolutely needed?
Well, I'm super spoiled with that darkroom. It's the best one I've ever had. I have like a 25-foot sink in there that I could print very large prints in there, which is really exciting. Haven't really done it yet. We haven't been here very long, but I will. And I have an 8x10 enlarger in there, which is a beast. So having this big space is fabulous.
Is there anything else you might want to say to someone who's looking at your work, what you hope for them, what you hope they take away?
I would hope that well, I don't know, there's a lot of hope there of things, but I would hope that they can see the beauty of these handmade prints as opposed to digital work, which I think can be very beautiful in its own right, but it's very different. And, you know, if the backstory comes through, all the better.